January 17, 1945. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The transport truck rolled to a stop beneath a canopy of Spanish moss and winter bare magnolias. Dust hung in the cold afternoon air. Inside the covered bed, 23 women sat pressed together on wooden benches, their threadbare coats pulled tight against bodies that had learned to make themselves small. They did not speak. They had not spoken since crossing the Atlantic, packed into the hold of a Liberty ship that smelled of oil and vomit and fear. Through the canvas flaps they could see American soldiers, tall, clean-shaven men in olive uniforms, forming two lines that led toward a cluster of whitewashed barracks. One of the women, a girl really, no more than 19, gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles turned the color of old paper. Her name was Margaret, though she had not heard anyone speak it in 3 years. She had learned to answer only to numbers, to orders, to the wet sounds men made in the dark. She waited now for the Americans to throw back the canvas and drag them out by their hair, as the Wehrmacht officers had done in Smolensk, as the SS guards had done in Krakow, as every man in every uniform she had ever known had done. She waited for hands that took without asking. The truck engine died. Silence settled like sediment. Then came a voice, firm but not cruel, speaking German with an American accent that stumbled over the consonants. "You will exit in single file. Take your time. Watch your step." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, something she had thought was already broken beyond repair. Men who gave warnings instead of orders. Men who stood at attention, arms at their sides, eyes fixed straight ahead, as the women climbed down from the truck one by one. Not one of them reached out. Not one of them stared. This was the beginning of something none of them had words for yet. Not disbelief exactly, but a kind of cognitive rupture, a tearing away of every truth they had built their survival upon. In the months that followed, in camps scattered across the American South and Midwest, thousands of German women who had served the Wehrmacht as what the Reich euphemistically called Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, but what everyone knew were glorified comfort women, sexual servants for officers, laundresses and cooks who paid for their rations with their bodies, would experience the same impossible contradiction. They had been told that American soldiers were animals, that they would be raped and murdered, that the democracy the Allies spoke of was merely a mask for barbarism. They had been prepared for violence. They had armored themselves against cruelty. What they were not prepared for, what shattered them more completely than any brutality could have, was respect. The story of these women, these shadow prisoners whose existence the Wehrmacht barely acknowledged, and whose treatment by their captors would become one of the most quietly radical experiments in human dignity ever conducted by a military force, is not one of heroism or glory. It is a story about the strange, transformative power of being seen as human when you have forgotten that you ever were. By the winter of 1945, the machinery of the Third Reich was collapsing in on itself like a dying star. The Ardennes offensive had failed. The Red Army was advancing from the east, grinding German divisions into the frozen mud of Poland and East Prussia. In the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The thousand-year Reich had 17 weeks left to live. In the chaos of retreat, as Wehrmacht units disintegrated and command structures dissolved, Allied forces began capturing not just soldiers but the entire logistical apparatus that had sustained the German war machine. Cooks, clerks, nurses, and women whose official designation was Stabshelferinnen or Nachrichtenhelferinnen, staff assistants and communications aides, but whose actual function within the military hierarchy was something the Geneva Convention had no category for. These were not uniformed combatants. They wore civilian clothes, often donated or scavenged, sometimes the same dress for months at a time. They carried no weapons. Most had no formal enlistment papers, no service numbers, no legal status within the Wehrmacht at all. They existed in a bureaucratic shadow, procured through a system that blended coercion, economic desperation, and outright kidnapping. Some had been recruited from occupied territories, Poland, Ukraine, France, with promises of food and safety. Others were German women from bombed-out cities, who had traded their bodies for survival when there was nothing else left to trade. Many had been teenagers when they were first pressed into service, sent to field headquarters or officer barracks where their duties were never officially documented, but universally understood. They cleaned, they cooked, they warmed beds, and when the Allied advance came, they were packed into trucks and trains alongside ammunition crates and medical supplies, evacuated not out of concern for their welfare but because they were property, assets that might still be useful if the front line stabilized. The Allied command had no protocol for them. The prisoner of war conventions addressed combatants, but these women occupied a liminal space between civilian and military, between victim and collaborator. British forces, when they first encountered groups of these women in Belgium and the Netherlands, often simply released them, sent them walking down muddy roads with no identification, no food, and nowhere to go. Soviet forces had a different approach. To the Red Army, these women were traitors to their sex, collaborators who had served the fascist enemy. The accounts that filtered back through intelligence channels were brief and brutal. Retribution was swift. Justice, in the Soviet understanding, did not require trials. The Americans, characteristically, tried to systematize the problem. In January 1945, Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, issued a memorandum classifying these women as civilian internees, Category C, which granted them certain protections under international law, but also mandated their detention until their status could be properly adjudicated. They were to be separated from military POWs, housed in designated camps, provided with adequate food and medical care, and this was the phrase that would later cause so much confusion among the women themselves, treated in accordance with the standards of human dignity befitting all persons regardless of their prior circumstances. It was a bureaucratic sentence, dry as chalk dust, written by lawyers in London who had never seen a woman flinch when a door opened suddenly, who had never watched someone eat a meal with their hands cupped around the plate, as if expecting it to be snatched away at any moment. But in practice, in the camps themselves, that single phrase would become the seed of something revolutionary. Camp Ruston, Louisiana, was built on former farmland, 86 acres of red clay and scrub pine that had been converted into a POW facility in 1943. By 1945, it housed nearly 4,000 German prisoners, most of them Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia, along with a smaller number of U-boat crewmen and Luftwaffe ground personnel. It was not a harsh camp by wartime standards. The prisoners worked in local sawmills and on nearby farms, earning 80 cents a day in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen. They played football in the exercise yard, organized a symphony orchestra, and published a weekly newsletter in German. The American guards were mostly older men, 4F classifications unfit for combat duty, or younger soldiers recovering from wounds that had ended their fighting days, but not their service. Many of them were farmers themselves, men from Arkansas and Texas, who saw the German POWs not as monsters but as conscripts, boys like their own sons, caught in a machine too big to escape. When the first group of women arrived in January, the camp commandant, a weary colonel from Iowa named Theodore Hansen, read through the shaft directive 3 times trying to understand what exactly he was supposed to do with them. The directive was clear about what he should not do. They were not to be integrated with the male prisoners, not to be assigned to labor details that brought them into contact with German POWs, not to be housed in the same barracks. But the positive instructions were vague. Adequate housing, medical evaluation, respectful treatment. Hansen, who had spent 32 years in the Army and thought he had seen every permutation of military absurdity, found himself staring at that last phrase for a long time. He assigned them to a section of the camp that had been used for administrative offices, 4 barracks arranged in a square around a small courtyard. He ordered the construction of a wooden fence, not a high one, just enough to provide visual separation from the main compound. He designated a female civilian employee from the nearby town, a schoolteacher named Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt, to serve as a liaison, someone the women could speak to without military formality. And then he did something that was not in the directive at all. something that came from instinct rather than regulation. He ordered every guard assigned to that section to undergo a 1-hour briefing on what he called, for lack of a better term, appropriate conduct. The briefing was held in a mess hall on a cold morning when the breath of 50 men fogged the windows. Hansen stood at the front with no notes, just his weathered face and his Iowa vowels, and he told them the truth as he understood it. These women had been used. That was the word he used. Used. Not by their choice, not as some kind of glamorous espionage or voluntary service, but because they had been ground up in the same machinery that had ground up everything else in Europe. Some of them had been forced. Some had been starved into compliance. Some had been girls, just girls when it started. And now they were here, scared out of their minds, expecting the worst because the worst was all they had ever known. "I don't care what you think of Germans," Hansen said, his voice flat and hard. "I don't care if you lost a brother in Normandy or a friend in the Bulge. These are not soldiers. These are not Nazis. These are women who have been through hell, and we are going to treat them like human beings, not because they've earned it, but because we are supposed to be the good guys. That's what we tell ourselves, isn't it? That we're better than them? Then we'd better goddamn act like it." He paused, looked out at the faces staring back at him. Young men, old men, skeptical men, angry men. Any man who can't do that? Any man who thinks being an American soldier means he's entitled to take something from a woman who can't say no. You can report to my office after this briefing, and I will transfer you to the worst posting I can find. No questions, no mark on your record, just gone. But if you stay, if you take this duty, then you follow the rules. No unnecessary contact. No entering the barracks without Mrs. Pruitt present. No jokes. No staring. No making them feel like they're on display. Eyes forward, mouths shut. You're guards, not gawkers. Understood? The men nodded. Some enthusiastically, some reluctantly, but they nodded. And when the first group of women, 23 of them, including Margaret, with her hollow eyes and bitten fingernails, were escorted to their barracks, the guards stood at their posts like statues. They did not leer. They did not comment. They did not reach out. And the women, who had spent years learning to read male attention like predators read the wind, felt the absence of that threat like a phantom limb. It was disorienting. It was terrifying in a new way. It was the first breath of air after drowning. In the first week, none of them spoke to the Americans. They moved through the routines of the camp like ghosts, lining up for meals in silence, eating with mechanical efficiency, returning to the barracks where they sat on their bunks and stared at the walls. Mrs. Pruitt, the schoolteacher who had been recruited as liaison, tried to engage them in conversation. Simple things, safe things, asking if the food was adequate, if they needed additional blankets, if anyone required medical attention. She received nods or headshakes, never words. It was not defiance. It was something deeper than that. A learned muteness, the understanding that speaking invited attention, and attention invited pain. But the camp had rhythms, and rhythms have a way of wearing down even the most carefully constructed defenses. Every morning at 8, a guard would knock on the barracks door, 3 sharp raps, always the same, and announce in accented German that breakfast was ready. He never opened the door until Mrs. Pruitt arrived to escort them. Every evening at 6, the same ritual for dinner. In between, they were left alone, but with one crucial difference from every other camp they had known. The guards did not patrol inside their courtyard. The wooden fence was not locked. There was a gate, and it stood open during daylight hours, leading to a small path that connected to the administrative building where Mrs. Pruitt had her office. They were told in clear terms that they could walk that path any time they needed to speak with her. They did not have to ask permission. They did not have to explain themselves. The path was theirs. For days, no one used it. The open gate was more frightening than a locked one because it implied choice, and choice implied consequence. But on the 8th day, a woman named Helene, 34 years old, a former seamstress from Essen, who had been with the Wehrmacht since 1942, walked through the gate, not to Mrs. Pruitt's office, not with any purpose, but just to walk. She stood in the January sunlight for 5 minutes, watching the way it slanted through the pine trees, listening to the sound of men laughing somewhere in the distant exercise yard, and then she went back inside. The guard at the nearest post had watched her, but only the way a shepherd watches sheep, marking her presence without engagement. She realized, sitting on her bunk afterward, that he had not moved toward her, had not questioned her, had not cared. The next day, 3 more women walked through the gate, then 6, then all of them, moving in a nervous cluster like birds testing the air before migration. And slowly, incrementally, the architecture of their fear began to crumble. The food was the second shock, after the respect. In Wehrmacht camps, rations had been survival: watery soup, black bread that was more sawdust than flour, occasionally a sliver of sausage or a potato. Calories calculated to keep a body functional, but never comfortable. But in American camps, the food was abundant to the point of absurdity. The first breakfast they were served included eggs. Actual eggs, not powdered but cooked fresh, 2 per person, along with bacon, toast, butter, and coffee with cream and sugar. Margaret stared at her plate for a full minute before touching it, certain that it was a mistake, that someone would realize and take it away. When no one did, she ate slowly, carefully, tasting each bite as if it might be the last. By the end of the first month, they had been served steak, chicken, fresh vegetables, milk, cheese, bread so soft it dissolved on the tongue. Every meal was more food than they had seen in weeks, sometimes months. And it was not just the quantity. It was the quality, the casual generosity of it, the way the kitchen staff piled food onto plates without measuring, without rationing, without the pinched arithmetic of scarcity. One of the women, a girl named Annalisa, who had worked in a field kitchen in Poland, asked Mrs. Pruitt if this was special treatment, if they were being fattened up for some purpose. Mrs. Pruitt looked confused by the question. "This is just how we feed people," she said. "This is normal. Normal." The word hung in the air like something from a foreign language. In the barracks that night, the women talked about it. The first real conversation they had allowed themselves. How could a country at war, a country that had been fighting on 2 fronts for years, have so much food that it could give prisoners steak? Where did it come from? How was it possible? Helene, the seamstress, who had read American magazines before the war, tried to explain about industrial farming, about the vast interior of the continent that had never been bombed, about a food supply chain so robust that even prisoners ate better than German civilians. But her explanations sounded like fairy tales. Margaret, lying in her bunk, thought about the propaganda she had heard in the Wehrmacht camps, how America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse, how German victory was inevitable because the Allies had no stomach for sacrifice. And yet here was a country that fed its enemies better than the Reich fed its own soldiers. The food became a symbol, a recurring proof that everything they had been told was a lie. Every meal was an argument against the ideology that had consumed Europe. Every full stomach was evidence of an abundance so vast it could afford mercy. But it was the small courtesies, more than the food, that broke them. In March, a shipment of supplies arrived at the camp: clothing, toiletries, books. The women were each given 2 dresses, new underwear, stockings, a coat, soap, shampoo, toothbrushes, sanitary napkins. Not used goods, not scavenged, but new items, factory fresh, packaged in paper that crinkled when opened. And with them, a note from the American Red Cross that Mrs. Pruitt read aloud. "These items are provided to ensure your comfort and dignity during your internment. You are entitled to these supplies as a matter of basic human rights." Entitled. Margaret turned the word over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. She had been entitled to nothing for 3 years. Entitlement was for officers, for men, for people whose lives had value. She was a body, a function, a thing to be used until it broke. And now an American organization run by civilians, by women, was telling her she had rights. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme it felt physical, like vertigo, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground was not solid. In April, the camp received a delegation from the YMCA, part of an inspection program to ensure compliance with the Geneva Conventions. The inspectors interviewed the women privately, without guards present, asking about their treatment, their living conditions, whether they felt safe. Margaret, chosen randomly to speak with a middle-aged man from Chicago who introduced himself as Mr. Garrett, sat in Mrs. Pruitt's office and tried to explain what it was like, but the words came out broken, inadequate. How could she describe the absence of violence? How could she make him understand that the most extraordinary thing about this camp was that nothing extraordinary happened? That she could sleep without fear, eat without payment, walk through the courtyard without calculating the cost? Mr. Garrett listened, took notes, and at the end of the interview he did something she did not expect. He thanked her. "Thank you for your time, Miss Margaret," he said, using the honorific as if she were a person of standing, a citizen. "Your testimony will help us ensure that all internees are treated fairly." She walked back to the barracks in a daze. He had called her Miss. He had acted as though her words mattered, as though her experience was data worth recording, as though she was a human being whose perspective had value. She sat on her bunk and cried for the first time since arriving in America. Not tears of pain or grief, but something more complicated. A mourning for the years when no one had treated her that way, mixed with a fragile, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be a person again. The transformation was not uniform. Some of the women adapted quickly, their resilience reasserting itself once the immediate threat receded. They formed small communities within the barracks, shared stories, began to laugh again, tentative at first, then more freely. Others remained locked inside themselves, eyes distant, bodies tense, waiting for the inevitable moment when the Americans would stop pretending and reveal their true nature. Margaret fell somewhere in between. She watched. She tested the boundaries. She spoke to Mrs. Pruitt in careful sentences, asking questions about America, about what would happen to them after the war, about whether it was true that women in America could own property, could vote, could walk down the street without a man's permission. Mrs. Pruitt answered every question with patience, sometimes pulling out books from the camp library, books in German, donated by universities, to show her the words in print, to prove that it was real. She explained the concept of civil liberties, of constitutional protections, of a legal system designed to limit government power rather than concentrate it. Margaret absorbed it all like someone learning a new language, one that described a world she had thought was mythical. In May, as the war in Europe ended and news of Germany's surrender filtered through the camp, the women gathered in the courtyard to hear the announcement on a radio that the guards had set up on a wooden table. They listened to Eisenhower's voice, flat and Midwestern, declaring the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. They listened to descriptions of the concentration camps that Allied forces had liberated, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the industrial machinery of genocide. They listened to the world learning what many of them had suspected but never spoke aloud, that the Reich they had served, in whatever capacity, was not just authoritarian or cruel, but evil in a way that had no precedent, no comparison. In the silence that followed the broadcast, Helene spoke. "We will never go home," she said, her voice hollow. "There is no home to go back to." It was true. Germany was rubble. The cities they had known were ash. The men who had used them were dead or in prison or fleeing. And even if they could return, what would await them? In the chaos of the post-war reckoning, women like them, women who had been with the Wehrmacht, who had worn civilian clothes but served military functions, who occupied the gray space between victim and collaborator, would be judged harshly by a population looking for scapegoats. The Americans might treat them with dignity, but their own people would not. Mrs. Pruitt, standing at the edge of the courtyard, heard Helene's words and made a decision that was not in any directive, any regulation, any official policy. She went to Colonel Hansen and told him that these women needed a future, not just detention. They needed a path forward, a way to rebuild. Hansen, who had spent the last 4 months watching his guards treat these women with decency and had seen the slow resurrection of their humanity, agreed. He began making calls, writing letters, pulling strings within the vast bureaucracy of the post-war military apparatus. He contacted refugee organizations, church groups, immigration lawyers. He argued that these women, as civilian internees who had been coerced into service, deserved consideration for asylum or emigration status. It took months. The paperwork was Byzantine, the legal precedents unclear. But Hansen was stubborn, and Mrs. Pruitt was relentless, and slowly, case by case, they began finding placements. Some of the women were sponsored by American families, often families of soldiers who had seen the camp firsthand and been moved by their stories. Others were sent to Canada, to Australia, to South America. A few, very few, chose to return to Germany, to search for surviving family or to reclaim whatever fragments of their old lives might remain. Margaret was among the last to leave. By the time her paperwork was finalized in October 1945, the camp was nearly empty, the male POWs already repatriated, the barracks echoing. Mrs. Pruitt drove her to the train station herself, a small suitcase in the back seat containing everything Margaret owned. 2 dresses, a coat, a pair of shoes, and a book Mrs. Pruitt had given her, a worn copy of Walden in German translation. They sat on the platform waiting for the train that would take her to New York, where she would board a ship to Canada, where a family in Toronto had agreed to sponsor her as a domestic worker. "I don't understand," Margaret said finally, the words she had been holding back for months. "Why did you do this? Why did you treat us like we mattered?" Mrs. Pruitt was quiet for a moment, watching the tracks stretch into the distance. "Because you do matter," she said. "Because the whole point of this war, the whole reason millions of people died, was to prove that there's a right way and a wrong way to treat human beings. If we'd treated you the way they treated you, what would we have won? We'd just be another army, another uniform, another boot. The only thing that makes us different, the only thing that makes any of this mean something, is that we choose to see people as people, even when it's hard, even when it costs us, even when the people we're looking at have been on the other side." Margaret looked down at her hands, at the scars on her knuckles from years of washing laundry in cold water, at the bitten nails that were finally starting to grow back. "In Germany, they told us Americans were weak because you believed in such things. That mercy was a kind of sickness." "Maybe it is," Mrs. Pruitt said, "but it's the best kind of sickness. It's the only one worth catching." The train arrived, steam and noise and the smell of coal. Margaret stood, picked up her suitcase, and turned back to Mrs. Pruitt one last time. She wanted to say something profound, something that would encompass the magnitude of what this woman, this school teacher from Louisiana, had done for her. But the words were too big, too clumsy. So she said the only thing she could. "Thank you." Mrs. Pruitt smiled, and there were tears in her eyes. "Go be free, Margaret. Go be the person you were supposed to be." Margaret boarded the train, found a seat by the window, and watched as the platform receded, as the camp, that strange sanctuary built from regulations and decency, disappeared into the Louisiana landscape. She thought about the 3 years she had spent learning to be invisible, to be silent, to be nothing. And she thought about the 8 months she had spent learning, slowly and painfully, to be something again. The Reich had told her she was worthless. The Americans had told her she had rights. One of those messages was a lie designed to control. The other was a truth designed to liberate. She opened the book Mrs. Pruitt had given her, found the passage marked with a ribbon. Thoreau, writing about the mass of men leading lives of quiet desperation, about the importance of living deliberately, about self-reliance and dignity. She read it twice, then closed the book and looked out at the passing fields, the abundant autumn harvest, the vastness of a country that had never known occupation, never known famine, never known the gnawing fear that everything could be taken away in an instant. This was what abundance looked like. Not just food, not just material wealth, but an abundance of possibility, of futures, of second chances, an abundance of mercy. The story of the women of Camp Ruston and the dozens of similar camps scattered across America is not one that appears in most histories of World War II. It is too small, too particular, too uncomfortable in its implications. It forces us to confront questions about complicity and victimhood, about how to treat those who were both harmed and harmful, about the obligations of victors to the vanquished. But it is also a story about the transformative power of institutional decency, about what happens when a military force decides that the measure of its strength is not in its capacity for violence but in its capacity for restraint. The women who passed through these camps, estimates suggest between 2 and 3,000 in total, carried their experiences into the post-war world like seeds. Some never spoke of their time with the Wehrmacht, burying those years under new names, new lives, new identities. Others became advocates, working with refugee organizations, with displaced persons, with other women who had survived the war's brutalities. Margaret, who became Margaret in Canada, eventually trained as a nurse, spending 30 years working in hospitals in Toronto, caring for patients with the same quiet attention that Mrs. Pruitt had shown her. When she retired, she began volunteering with an organization that helped refugees from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from the wars that followed the war she had lived through. She never spoke publicly about her time in Camp Ruston, but she kept the copy of Walden on her nightstand until the day she died in 1987, the ribbon still marking Thoreau's passage about living deliberately. What she learned in that camp, what all of them learned, was that democracy is not an abstraction, not a system of government or a set of laws. It is a practice, a daily choosing to see the humanity in others, even when, especially when, they have been stripped of everything that makes humanity visible. It is the guard who keeps his eyes forward, the bureaucrat who writes adequate housing into a directive and means it, the schoolteacher who drives a former enemy to the train station and calls her by name. It is the radical act of treating dignity not as something that must be earned, but as something that cannot be taken away. The Third Reich ran on a different principle. It measured human value as a calculation, a hierarchy, a zero-sum contest where one group's ascension required another's annihilation. It built an empire on the logic that might makes right, that power is its own justification, that mercy is weakness, and it lost. Not just militarily, though it lost that too, but philosophically, morally, in every way that matters. It lost because at the end, when the accounting was done, the countries that had chosen mercy, that had fed their prisoners and respected their dignity and built camps with open gates, those countries had something the Reich never could: the moral authority to rebuild the world. In the ruins of post-war Europe, as the Allies faced the overwhelming task of reconstruction, they were guided by a principle that seemed naive to many: that lasting peace could only be built on justice, and justice required seeing even your enemies as human. The Marshall Plan, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of these emerged from the recognition that the only way to prevent another war was to create systems that valued human dignity above national interest. It was an experiment, unproven and idealistic, but it was an experiment that women like Margarete had already lived through in microcosm, in camps where American soldiers had proven that you could be strong without being cruel, victorious without being vengeful. The wooden gate at Camp Ruston, that simple threshold that stood open during daylight hours, was more than an architectural feature. It was a symbol of a deeper truth: that freedom is not the absence of boundaries, but the presence of choice; that dignity is not bestowed by the powerful, but recognized by the just; that the measure of a civilization is not in how it treats its heroes, but in how it treats those who have no power to demand better. When the camp was decommissioned in 1946, the barracks were torn down, the fence removed, the land returned to its original owners. Nothing remains now but a historical marker on Highway 33, a small bronze plaque that mentions the German POW camp that once stood there, the sawmill workers and farmers who lived behind wire and dreamed of home. It does not mention the women, the shadow prisoners, the comfort girls who learned in that place that there was a world where men could be trusted to keep their distance, where a knock on the door was a courtesy rather than a threat, where food was abundant and respect was given freely. But the women remembered. They carried that memory like a talisman, a proof that humanity was not extinct, that somewhere in the wreckage of the 20th century, there had been men who chose decency over dominance, who built fences not to imprison, but to protect, who understood that the true victory was not in conquest, but in the refusal to become the thing they fought against. And in the end, that may be the most enduring legacy of the American occupation. Not the Marshall Plan or the UN or the democratic governments installed in Germany and Japan, but the countless small moments when individual soldiers and bureaucrats and school teachers chose to treat their enemies as human beings, even when no one was watching, even when the regulations were vague, even when it would have been easier to look away. Those moments, accumulated across years and miles and millions of interactions, became the foundation of a new order, one built not on power alone, but on the recognition that power without justice is tyranny, and justice without mercy is merely revenge. Margaret understood this, sitting by her window in Toronto in the last years of her life, watching snow fall on a city that had given her refuge, reading Thoreau's words about deliberate living and thinking about the girl she had been, the woman she had become. She thought about the fear she had carried for so long, the certainty that all men were predators, that all uniforms meant violence, that survival required making yourself invisible. And she thought about the moment that certainty broke, standing in the January sunlight in Louisiana, watching a guard who did not move toward her, did not threaten her, did not care. That was when she learned that the world could be different. Not perfect, never perfect, but different. That there were places where abundance was not hoarded but shared, where power was not wielded but restrained, where mercy was not weakness but strength. That the open gate was not a trap but an invitation, not to escape but to return, to reclaim the self that had been buried under years of survival. She learned that freedom is not the absence of fences, but the presence of doors that open from the inside. And she learned that democracy, in the end, is nothing more and nothing less than the daily practice of treating others as you would wish to be treated, of building systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them, of choosing, again and again, to see the human being behind the uniform, the refugee, the enemy, the stranger. It is a lesson the world forgets and remembers and forgets again, across generations, across borders, across the endless cycles of conflict and reconciliation. But it is a lesson that lives on in the testimony of those who experienced it firsthand, who felt the difference between a camp where guards looked away because they did not care, and a camp where guards looked away because they cared too much to stare, who tasted the abundance of a country that could afford to feed its prisoners steak, and understood that such abundance was not merely material but moral, a surplus of compassion that could be extended even to those who had no claim to it, no right to expect it, no power to demand it. That is what Margaret took with her when she boarded the train in October 1945. Not just a suitcase and a book, but a knowledge that would sustain her through decades, through the hard work of building a new life, through the moments when the old fears returned, and she had to remind herself that the world had changed, that she had changed, that the girl who expected violence with every open door had become a woman who could open doors herself. The Reich had promised her order, had given her only chaos and cruelty. America had promised her nothing, and given her the one thing she needed most, the chance to discover, slowly and painfully and triumphantly, that she was still capable of being human. In the end, that was the victory that mattered, not the battles won or the cities liberated, but the individual souls reclaimed from the machinery of dehumanization, one by one, in camps with open gates and guards, who understood that the truest form of strength is the willingness to show mercy to those who cannot fight back. It was a quiet victory, undocumented and uncelebrated, but it was a victory nonetheless, and it echoes still in every moment when someone chooses compassion over cruelty, dignity over dominance, the open gate over the locked door. It echoes in the work of nurses and teachers and advocates who learned, in the most unlikely of classrooms, that humanity is not a resource to be extracted but a potential to be nurtured, and that the measure of a life well lived is not in how much you take, but in how much you give to those who have nothing left to offer in return. That is the story of the German comfort women who were shocked when American soldiers respected their privacy. It is a story about war and peace, about cruelty and mercy, about the ways in which individuals can transcend the systems that create them. But most of all, it is a story about the transformative power of simple human decency. The knock on the door, the open gate, the plate of food given freely, the honorific spoken to someone who had forgotten she had a name. It is a story worth remembering, even now, especially now, in a world that still struggles to distinguish between strength and violence, between justice and vengeance, between the locked gate and the open door. Because the lesson those women learned in Louisiana in 1945 is the lesson every generation must learn anew, that the only thing that makes us human is our willingness to recognize the humanity in others, even when, especially when, they have been reduced to something less, even when it costs us, even when no one is watching. That is the legacy of Camp Rustin. That is the victory that endures.